Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Contrary to popular belief, the Ottoman Empire did undergo a very gradual revolution in print and communication technology. Pamphlets became a fixture of popular debate and offers insight into the increasing polarization of the Ottoman Empire. A new book, The Order and Disorder of Communication, takes us on a tour of the Ottoman information landscape. Joining us is the author Nir Shafir. Nir Shafir is an associate professor of history at UCSD, whose work focuses on the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East from 1200 to 1800. At UCSD, he teaches graduate and undergraduate classes on the history of early modern and medieval Middle East, the history of science, global history, and historical approaches to disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. He is an occasional contributor and editorial board member of the Ottoman History Podcast and has served as editor in 2018. Future projects include a social history of the Turkish language in the Ottoman Empire and investigations into the cultural role of antiquity and antiquarianism in the early modern Middle East. His first book is titled The Order and Disorder of Communication, Pamphlets and Polemics in the 17th Century Ottoman Empire, and came out of Stanford University Press in October 2024. Nir Shafir, welcome to Memo Conversations.
Thank you, Osman, for having me.
So, reading your bio, actually, I found some of the other stuff that you're going to be pursuing kind of interesting, and so I might ask you at the end a bit more about those. But before we sort of go into the main topic, which will be your new book, I will sort of want to get an idea of what got you interested in the very question of history of science in the Ottoman Empire and why this region at all, in fact.
Sure, two things. Well, one is, it was a bit random chance that I ended up taking a class in my graduate studies about the history of science. And I found it fascinating. It was all about how science doesn't just progress gradually or rationally from one good idea to another, but actually, it's heavily tied together to the social world that we live in, that, the reason why certain ideas are adopted or not adopted has nothing to do necessarily with their actual intellectual content, at least not always. And then at the same time, as I was taking this class, I realized that this wasn't really good work on the Middle East, on the Islamic world, on the Ottoman Empire, all the regions that I was studying. Instead, there was a narrative about the rise of a medieval Islamic golden age, and then there was, decline, and then a revival, a sort of westernization, a readoption of Western science. And I found that kind of lacking. I wanted to see what was in the middle part, what happened in the kind of years between 1500 to 1800 when it just wasn't clear. It couldn't all just been decline and stagnation or people not saying anything new. And at the same time, once I jumped into to do my research, when I was going out there to look at manuscripts, basically, I started off looking at travelogues. I just realized that there was just an entire world of works, of authors, of topics that just no one knew about, that no one had ever really touched upon. We kept talking about the same two authors, people like, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, a traveler called Evliya Çelebi, or a famous writer named Mustafa Ali. But there was hundreds, thousands of other people out there writing. And as I kind of tracked down their works and I saw how they're grouped together and who they responded to and what they were writing and the topics, I realized that there's just this other entire intellectual networks, worlds that needed to be kind of explored. And that's how I got interested also in this question of communication, the material aspects of communication in a manuscript society. Because you have to remember, during this period, everyone is writing almost all books by hand, right? They're not printing anything. They're not certainly not sending them on telegram or old school telegrams or modern school smartphone telegrams. They're copying everything by hand, and I was just interested in this technology of communication and how it all worked out.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, actually, because I mean, we reviewed your book at Middle East Monitor, and I read it personally. Have the idea that there's a sort of decline, as you've put it, and in the sort of Islamic world in the Middle East, and you sort of see this as the rise of Europe, and a lot of conventional historical narratives, which I know is probably is undermined a bit more now, but the traditional view, which you can still find in sort of the popular, historical circles, is the printing press comes along, the Gutenberg press in 15 something or rather, 1517.
1400 somewhere,
Oh,
1430, I want to say. I can't even remember myself.
somewhere in the 15th century there was
Yeah.
Gutenberg press, and this was enabled the Europeans in places like Germany and elsewhere to start printing books, on effective eventually en masse through these machines that could print books rather than doing everything by hand, which was still the case in the Ottoman world. And we tend to think of this as being the pinnacle moment where everything shifts westwards, as it were, towards Europe, towards what will become the Western world. But you sort of I mean, I know this narrative is a bit more undermined now, but you sort of take this narrative on in a way because you sort of say, well, no, this is not the whole picture. So talk to us, why is this what is this idea, first of all, if you could flesh it out a bit further, the narrative, and why do you think it's lacking? Why do you think it's wrong? What do you think your story sort of does to undermine this a little?
Yeah. So there's a sort of focused argument of the book, which is all about polemics and polarization and these big social religious fights that were occurring in the 17th century in the Ottoman Empire. And I wanted to tie them to a form of communication, essentially to look how they emerged out of the disorder of communication that was occurring at the time. And I realized to explain that I needed to go into the basics of how were books produced, how did they circulate, how did people learn to read and to write, and how were they educated in general. And then I found out that there just wasn't that much, and much of what was there kind of subscribed to this, what I would call a sort of ideology of print. Right? And I think you kind of described it well. It's these momentous societal changes that we attach to certain types of technology, scientific technology, in this case, the printing press, but we can also attach them, of course, to other forms of communication technologies like the telegraph, the television, the internet, social media, etc. And in fact, the way that we narrativize or we narrate histories of technology is about these momentous amounts of revolutions that transform society. And what I wanted to do is basically take a step back and say, well, let's see if this is true or not. There's things that we associate with the printing press, right? So mass production of books, which apparently leads to mass literacy, the rise of mass media, something called a public sphere, new forms of religiosity like the Reformation, new forms of thought like the Renaissance, and with that eventually tied to things like the scientific revolution and these major transformational changes. But a lot of it, goes back down to the question of, increase in the number of readers, the increase in the number of books, and what is actually going on here, and how in that narrative that basically books become cheaper because they're just become much easier to produce. And what I want to point out that this is kind of all just partially it's an imagined vision of what print actually does. And there's a lot of historians of printing in Europe that have gone through this and shown, it's not a revolution, it's an evolution, and it's the impact of print was, slow. It definitely did not create more sound or reliable volumes as before, etc. There are all these things that we imagine that print did is actually not quite true. In our case, though, there's still this image that manuscripts, though, that it, by copying things by hand are, one, expensive, that they limit textual production, and that they radically limit readership and education. And I realized that no one actually has sat down and tried to prove this for the pre-modern Islamic world, or most of the world, which actually wasn't printing. And if you actually go and look at what, how much did books cost? What did it cost to make a book? How many people were reading and how? a very different portrait emerges. And so that's kind of the first chapter of the book, is that I just wanted to reimagine what book production would look like in this period and in this group. And what I found is, and again, this is not just my research, I'm leaning heavily on many others' work, especially that of people like Meredith Quinn and Ismail Irunsal and others who've done the kind of deep down research. One is that if you look at actual book prices, most books were cheap. There were the majority of books were within the realm of a Bible commodity, like half a kilo of olives, or a bit of, a kilo of olives, local olives, or I think like half a kilo of coffee or something like that. So you could buy a book, and then that's most of what was circulating. And this is very different from the image that we would get if you go to a museum of Islamic art, right? And you look at this book section, right? And you see these large books with their fancy illuminations, these elaborate covers. Those were very expensive books, but those were not the types of books that were most commonly found, right? The books that were most commonly found were just probably cheap, relatively, probably unbound, quickly copied, and used in an everyday section. And once you shift over to that paradigm and you realize that's the majority of the material that was circulating, you have to kind of reimagine what was actually being exchanged at that time. Now, and I look basically at one type of cheap book, which is what I call a pamphlet, and I can talk more about that in a second. I do want to point out that it's not that printing and manuscript, the printing press doesn't have any sort of effect. And obviously, mass makes way more books than copying books by hand. And this is important to note. A manuscript culture and a printing culture are not exactly the same, in that there's just way more books in a printed world. The difference, though, I think, is not that this limited the amount of education, the amount of readers. By the way, the number of readers based off of what we call probate records. Basically, when people died, the state went through their belongings to settle inheritance. And from that, we can tell at least what percentage of the population had books. And that's a good proxy for perhaps readers, literacy, et cetera. We basically in the 16th, 17th century might have between 10 to 20% literacy in major cities. My point being is that what print does, it just mass produces books, but most of those books are not actually read by the people. The printers need to sell them, right? They need to get this material out and to make money from this massive investment that they've done to print these books. And so what printing does is actually commercializes book production, at least in Western Europe. That's the one place where it really happened. Printing becomes a business. It's all about selling books as far as possible, or creating protected markets in which you can make enough money. Otherwise, you get the situation that you have in basically the Ottoman Empire or East Asia or many other parts of the world, where there are multiple experiments with printing, whether typography, that's metal type, or with xylography, that's woodblock printing. And in that case, printing is just really expensive, and it's always is not profitable. Almost every printer, if they try to just support themselves, goes out of business. And instead, they need the support of governments or religious institutions, et cetera, to make any sort of living or continuous printing enterprise. And I think that's what people lose out. They think of printing and manuscript production in the like some sort of middle school algebra problem. If Nancy copies one book, can copy a book by hand in 4 hours, and Thomas can print the same book in 20 minutes, who can print more books in the course of a day or something? But that's not how it works, because you have to think about the massive amounts of investment that it takes to print something, and then the time it takes to recoup that money, et cetera. And that just basically never really materialized, except for Western Europe. That commercialized world of book production never materialized except in Western Europe and parts of East Asia after the 17th century.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, you have this narrative that the Ottoman Empire banned the printing press, but there doesn't seem to be much evidence that they did, in fact, ban it. And in fact, we see multiple times where they're issuing licenses to printing presses, whether that's for very specific communities or specific goals, or, if anyone just sort of says, well, I'd quite like to have a printing press, they might issue it. But as you've sort of mentioned just now, it was very expensive and just not profitable until about the 18th and 19th centuries in the Ottoman world. In Europe, it was sort of commercial, much more commercially successful. But I think a sort of parallel to this, which I thought was interesting that your book points out, drawing on the study of others, is that in fact, copying by hand books got cheaper over the century. So in the medieval period, you sort of look at, people of different stratas in society, and you looked at skilled laborer and how much days of work they would have to do to be able to afford any kind of book. And it went down from something akin to 40-ish days to, if they went for the cheapest book available, to about a day by the time you're in the 17th century. So my first question here then is, well, why did it get cheaper to buy handmade books?
Yeah, so two things here. Just to go back to what you were saying right at the beginning. Yeah, I mean, there's, I think, this ideology of print, this idea that print is such a self-evident technology that only people that are, backwards or unmodern would somehow reject it, is so ingrained into our heads that most of the explanations as to why the Ottomans, or really any sort of pre-modern Islamic peoples, or even Eastern Europeans, etc., rejected print, or did not adopt print, rather, always turn on the towards cultural explanations. That, as you said, that the sultans banned print, and as Catherine Schwartz has shown in her article, there's no basis for this. Other people talk about the fact that there was an aesthetic preference for handwriting, or that there was a religious invocation against the adaptation of European technologies, or I think perhaps a bit more convincingly, but in this case not true at all, is that the copyists were against printing technology and commissioned and forced the government to ban it, etc. None of this is actually true, and I think a more reasonable understanding comes if we just look at the economics of book production at the time, and just how much more flexible and relatively functional manuscript technology was. Now, to go back to, sorry, repeat the second question.
So the question was, why did it get cheaper to produce handmade books?
So it's a bit hard to tell. The big thing here is basically the introduction of paper. And again, this is a sort of technological transformation that seems to have come about from Central Asia, possibly from the Chinese, but seems to have radically transformed the nature of book production in the Middle East and antique world. So before, people used paper, and remember, paper up basically until the 19th century, from let's say 800 to 1900, is made as what we call rag paper. You take linen rags, usually underwear. You smash it up, you pulverize it, and then you bleach it, clean it, etc., and then you use that to make paper. So it's actually very very sturdy, much better than a lot of the paper our books are made from today. And in fact, if you look at old paper, you'd be surprised just how functional, and unless it's been eaten by animals, that it just stays and doesn't degrade. Now, that technology probably came from Bukhara. It was adopted by Abbasid courtiers, etc., and then it spreads from Baghdad to the rest of the Middle East. Interestingly, it doesn't get picked up by the northern part of the Mediterranean, right? So what we call Western and Central Europe, until about 1300, 1400, after the Crusades. But during this period, this radically changes the cost of books. So before that, you had two options. You had papyrus, or you had parchment. Papyrus, I think you can grow it in parts of Egypt or Iraq, a bit more brittle, not the best surface, but more functional. Whereas parchment you can make anywhere, but you needed a lot of basically baby goats and sheep to make it. And so the cost of a book on that end would be just astronomical. A long book would require possibly 100 animals or something like that, which was an enormous sum back then. Whereas paper just was much cheaper and easier to use, and as more and more people adopted it, the price came down, it became more and more available, et cetera. And there was local paper production in many different parts of the Middle East. Now it's hard to say exactly if the prices went down or not. I think the research that I cited there by a woman named Maya Schatzmiller relies on relatively few data points. It's hard to say whether this is conclusive or not, but it seems true that as paper became more readily adopted between the, let's say, 900 to 1200, prices came down with it. Now, basically, the technology of books and paper production didn't change from 800 to 1800. But there are some changes here. Most noticeably, eventually Europeans, specifically Italians, started producing paper in the late 1300s, 1400s. And then, I don't know why, it's not clear why, but they were able to produce it much more cheaply. So much so that by 1500, they essentially eliminated most local paper production in the Middle East, and anywhere on the Mediterranean littoral could import paper at much cheaper prices. Now, it's hard. I don't have enough evidence to say this is the cause of even cheaper books, but this is one reason for the an always increasing rise of bookishness and book production in this area.
So within the sort of book itself, you talk about the 17th century as being a pivotal moment where we sort of see the rise of something we would call today a public space, right? So I sort of want to ask you here, in the 16th, 17th century, what does a public space mean and look like?
Yeah. Well, no, it's a good question. So I would just first just think about, when we say public space, what do we mean today? We might mean like something like a park or some literal space, right? But here we're talking about something sometimes called a public sphere, sometimes called publicity, public opinion, but essentially the capacity for ideas and words and opinions to circulate essentially virtually between people who don't know each other, that we would consider strangers. And so the idea that I borrow from a critic, literary critic, is that I'm not talking about the public or the public sphere, but something called publics, which is just a type of social entity that emerges from the circulation of a text between strangers. They don't have to be literal strangers, but they don't know each other as individuals. They're not meeting in person, right? And this is kind of what one of the things that the book is trying to show is that, it's not that scholars or historians haven't noticed that there's been a lot of books produced in the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic world. In fact, everyone knows it's a very bookish place. But the way that books were used often centers around either interpersonal exchange. So imagine what's called a majlis, like a salon or a kind of sitting session, right? So everyone's sitting down, they see each other, they're talking, they have their books out, they see each other face to face. Or it's kind of like long distance epistolary networks, right? So people sending letters and books, from Yemen to Indonesia, or from Hyderabad to whatever, Istanbul or something like that. Actually, they don't exist that long, but these sorts of like individual to individual kind of contact is how people mostly imagine that books circulated. And I'm saying, yes, there's obviously that. There is that in-person, individual to individual contact, but there's also a way for books to move about. And usually we don't think of that because we only imagine that occurring in the space in which print exists, in which books are so mass-produced and are circulated by the market that that people encounter them no matter what, and then you get the creation of publics, et cetera. And I'm saying, no, you can actually look and see that publics are being created in manuscript society. And the way I do that is by looking at what I call pamphlets. Should I get into explain what a pamphlet is, Osman?
Yes, you can do.
So what do I mean by pamphlets? Is I kind of lay out there basically cheap, short, highly polemical, pretty mobile texts They're about 2 to 20 folios long. They don't take long to copy, maybe an hour or two. A bit longer if they're more than 20 pages. And they're usually devoted to some of the polemical debates of the 17th century period. They're usually about social religious practices, kind of everyday things that Muslims would do that would make them think about is this allowable for Muslims or not? And these, over the course of the 1600s, these debates became so heated that if you look at the pamphlets themselves, people are calling each other heretics, they're calling each other fanatics, extremists, mutazilites, which is a kind of insult from the medieval period, all sorts of other things. And you get a sort of polarization of society. So just to give you a few examples, some of these are about, is it okay for Muslims to smoke tobacco? Can they do a weird medical procedure called chickpea cauterization? I can explain that in a second if you want. Can I pray at the grave of saints? Can I say that I belong to the religion of Abraham if I'm a Muslim? There's hundreds of these. In fact, they're just every type of social practice could eventually become one of these debates. And more importantly, they all got kind of polarized into one gigantic culture war. So you could tell based off of the opinion about, let's say, smoking, what that person thought about something like dhikr, which is a sort of Sufi seance or event. And you can tell what the lines that people or readers and writers would fall on based off of that. So the book basically looks into the connection between these polemics and one form of publication, that is the pamphlet. And so not only is the pamphlet a forum, but I also argue that it's kind of fueling these debates itself. Let me just take a drink of water.
All right.
Okay.
So that's very interesting, the rise of that. And the sort of question before we sort of get into some of the details of these pamphlets and the movements they sort of spring out of them, the question I sort of have here, because this is also a sort of contemporary question that we are sort of asking now, is to what extent is the form created because there's an audience, and to what extent is the actual form itself creating the audience? So when we talk about the polarization which these pamphlets sort of play into, are these pamphlets, creating the polarization, or is the polarization already there and it's just giving voice to it?
That's a good question. So my sense, there's different ways to imagine how a public discussion goes or a public debate goes or operates. And I often found that initially I thought that, that there was an exchange going on, and that people were reading and being persuaded by these pamphlets, and everyone on different sides was kind of responding to one another. And over time, I found that the pamphlets were relatively one-sided, that the purpose of these works was not to convince another person of the opposing reader of your viewpoint, but it was actually to share arguments, to find allies, to solidify support. And as I argue, actually, that the pamphlets themselves are creating publics of readers. And in fact, the people are kind of forming into these polarized social entities based off of what they read, who they decide is reliable or not, and which books they decide are fake or not. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation there.
Indeed. It feels like, that does feel like one of the most contemporary parts of the book, because we're having that debate right now, or been having it for years, last few years. But I sort of now want to get into some of the details. We're going to get into the sort of rebellions that happen. But before we get there, you talk about chickpea colorization and the tobacco debate. Could you tell us a little bit about what these things were and why they were being debated?
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying, that a lot of the way I explain this book is basically a question of, what was social media like in the 17th century, in a place where people didn't have the internet, much less printed books. How do we tie in an event like not polarization or religious polarization of society to a technology of communication. And of course, there's many differences. For example, these weren't about the news. Today, it's all about news, right? Political information, what is going on. Can you believe that the government arrested this person or this person said that, etc.? These weren't the nature of the debates. Instead, the debates were about, can I do this as a Muslim or not? And often they were just things you would do every day, right? So they're not grand theological questions. What's the nature of God? Does he have two natures or not, as people were arguing in a Byzantine society before the rise of Islam or something like that. Instead, they're really arguing about things that they would do everyday practices that they really started questioning and saying, should a Muslim do this or not? Some of these used to be very common. For example, it became a habit of sorts among Ottoman Muslims to say that if you're a Muslim, you declared, I belong to the religion of Abraham. And this is a sort of Quranic thing that they took up. And then in the 17th century, people started arguing, no, you can't say that because that suggests that you worship Abraham instead of Muhammad and things like that, and you're not a real Muslim, and then it becomes this whole debate. But this was something they were doing, every day or every time they said, what religion are you? And he said, I belong to the religion of Abraham, and it becomes, again, this daily thing. And so smoking is another one of these. Smoking tobacco, tobacco is introduced from the Americas around 1600, quickly takes off. Tobacco production develops already in the Middle East in the 1600s. And of course, people are smoking, and there's a large debate over whether or not it's healthy and how it is allowed, etc. Is it intoxicating in the same way that alcohol is or not, and therefore is it not allowed? But there's another debate there, which I don't touch upon so deeply, but you can look into the book of my colleague Aslıhan Gürbüzal, which is really part of the debate over smoking is whether or not the government has the right to enforce social norms that should be technically relegated by religious law, by religious scholars who are supposed to be independent from the government. And you can see this type of the debate that I emphasize more closely is this one of chickpea cauterization. It's called K al-Hamasa. K means cauterization, Hamasa means chickpea. And it's this really weird medical procedure that became very popular, probably started in Damascus in the 1630s or 40s. Someone would have some sort of localized pain, and then you would take a cautery, right? So take a hot iron, you make a hole in the body where that pain is probably most closely located. And then rather than using that cautery to just, close an opening or to eliminate, I don't know, bacteria or whatever it is that people were using cauteries for, they kept the wound open with a chickpea. They would take a whole chickpea and stick it in there. Then they would put a piece of paper or a leaf over it and then bind it with some cloth. Now, the whole point of the chickpea is that it was supposed to suppurate. So it's supposed to, some sort of liquid is supposed to come out of it. Now, that liquid is either pus or something they call white liquid. And that was supposed to be the negative, harmful substance coming out of your body. And you would keep this wound open for a few weeks, basically. Now, why was this controversial? It wasn't about the medical efficacy of this procedure. Instead, it was actually about this liquid. If you are Muslim, you would know that you would have to be in a state of ritual purity in order to pray. It's called wudu in Arabic or abdest in Turkish and Persian. And if you have substances dripping from your body, this negates it, right? So obviously feces, urine, but also breast milk and blood and other things. Now the question is this material that's coming out of this wound, what is it? If it's just water, it's fine. But if it's something else, then it would negate your prayers. So the whole debate basically revolves around, do people with this procedure, do their prayers count or not? How can you tell if the person next to you has it? Because it was wildly popular. Apparently everyone was doing it. So you can imagine you go to the mosque, you can't tell if the person next to you has had this procedure because the bandage is under their kaftan or whatever. And then you have to, and then you have to think, well, is the person next to me really praying, or is he not praying? Is it all like, should he be praying somewhere else? Should he redo his prayers? Is he really a Muslim or not? And this is how they all keep going. And it's all about daily practices that Muslims can do or not. That specifically became very polemical and polarizing in the 17th century.
So this sort of brings us to the next sort of topic, which is connected to this period, which is the rise of the so-called Kadizadeli. How do you pronounce this
Yeah,
name?
Kadizadeli. It's one of these weird words that we have in Ottoman or Turkish historiography that just doesn't make any sense to anyone who doesn't speak Turkish.
Yes, yes, it was a sort of, and so this is an interesting area because, of course, for a lot, I mean, this is something you do take issue with in the book, but just to sort of quickly outline it, they're often described as being the sort of precursor to modern Salafism, right? So they're the idea that Salafism is a sort of modern movement. We can sort of think about it from 18th or 19th century onwards, more 19th century actually, where you have this idea that there was this ideal sort of Muslim society and ideal Muslim, which was the Salaf, the companions of the Prophet and the first generation of Muslims, and that the objective of a Muslim is to return to that kind of period, to that kind of piety, to emulate its kind of ways of being and living. And this has been described when a number of people described the Kadizadelis as this kind of movement before this modern Salafism, but this is obviously a description you took issue with, and in fact, you argue isn't the case. So perhaps you could sort of outline, what was this actual movement?
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. So to make a complicated question quick and short, let me try to explain it this way. So historians noticed already in the 1950s or 60s that the chronicles kept mentioning these extremists. One of the chroniclers called Naima, called Kadizadelis. Kadizadeh here is named after a man. It means judge's son, but it's named after a person called Kadizadeh Mehmed or Muhammad. And a Kadizadeli, which is that Turkish adjectival suffix at the end of Kadizadeh, makes it someone who follows Kadizadeh. And so it was a way of saying that these people are kind of fanatical followers of Kadizadeh Mehmed, who, as the early writings about it, were just kind of religious extremists. In the wake of the 1980s and the Iranian Revolution, they were reinterpreted as sort of basically Islamic fundamentalists who were motivated by economic dissatisfaction, basically not being able to have jobs, and then rose against the kind of mores of the time, specifically attacking the Sufis and other forms of Islamic religiosity. And since then, it's been connected to forms of what we would call today Salafism, right? So this modern notions of forms of Islamic fundamentalism or ideas of going back to the original period of the time of Prophet Muhammad. One of the things I want to point out in the book is that two things. First is that there's a group of people who these debates over what it means to be Muslim revolve often around a question of, well, how do you define what is a Muslim? Whose standards of Muslimness should be taken? And one group basically always refers back to Islamic law and says, Islamic law is the center of being Muslim, and that's what we should do. And so if the jurists say that, if you have a medical procedure that this liquid comes out and then you can't pray, then that's what you should do. And you can't call yourself a Muslim if you have this procedure. Or if you smoke tobacco, or if you pray, etc. And this is the basics of Islam. And other people said, well, no, Islam is not just the Sharia. It's not just the law. It's actually a whole bunch of other stuff. It's being tied to the Prophet, the family of the Prophet Muhammad. It's about being close to God through being close to his friends, the so-called saints. It's about forms of philosophy that allow us a direct nature of God, direct connection to God, etc. Whole bunch of other things. And unlike today, these were actually probably these other forms, non-legal forms of being Muslim, were probably a lot stronger than the legal forms of being Muslim. And so there was a group that was actually just constantly insisting that really it's just about the law. It's just about the Sharia. That's the only way you can define what it means to be Muslim. Now, previous work has called these people Kadizadelis. And I didn't like that term because it's not a term that this group, this movement used for itself. They just called themselves Sunnis or Muslims, which also wasn't helpful. Kadizadeli was a sort of insult that the chroniclers made up to label them as kind of extremist fanatics that just followed preachers. And so I thought, well, what defines this group? And it's really about their, as Katerina Ivania has defined them through the work of Birgevi, which is a 16th century scholar who inspired them. It's all about purifying the self by comparing your daily actions to what it says in the law and the Sharia. And that's why I come up with the term legalist to define them. It's all about seeing Islam as defined solely by the law and trying to enforce that in daily life. And that's a bit different from Salafism, right? It's not about going back to the example of the Prophet Muhammad. These people, even though they were sometimes insulted, these people didn't want to go back in time. They didn't see themselves living in confrontation with some sort of new modernity or European different otherness. They just wanted Islam to be about the Sharia. And that's a bit different very different actually from what goes on in the 19th to 20th century. And, sometimes we just tend to, historians just draw a line from, let's say, for those of you that know Islamic history, from Ibn Hanbal to Ibn Taymiyyah to the Kadizadelis to the Wahhabis to I don't know, Abdul and Rashid Rida and all these people and Hassan al-Banna in the 20th century. And you just want to connect them all the way through. And I'm saying, well, no, there's multiple different visions of this. They're not all the same, basically, and that we shouldn't disconnect them from what's today.
So what was this is obviously a very key movement, because as you said, it does come up a lot in chronicles from that time. But aside from sort of making these arguments, what else did they do that aroused so much mention in, chronicles? There's obviously things like rebellions happening at the time. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit about this and the sort of role that you feel the press, the pamphlets play in these sorts of events?
Yeah, thank you. So these legalists, I wouldn't say they were heavily mentioned in the chronicles, but they did occasionally erupt into them. And that's partially because they would on occasion gather and make demands from the government, essentially, shut down this Sufi lodge. Sometimes they would gather in, vigilante mobs and attack Sufis and shrines and things like that. But really, the only times they were actually frequently mentioned in chronicles is when the government thought that they were being a threat to the government, and then they, for example, when they stormed judges' houses or citadels in Cairo, etc., and then they were, attacked, basically shut down directly. But this doesn't mean that people at that time didn't take this seriously. And in fact, people, both the legalists themselves, were a phenomenon, as I argue, that spread throughout the empire. It wasn't just an Istanbul thing or elsewhere. And as the 17th century went on, life became much more polarized, and you see a very clear escalation of discourse on both sides calling each other, the other heretics and so forth. The anti-legalists calling for their suppression by the government, also calling them heretics and Mutazilites and extremists and other things. And you see this in Cairo, and you see this in Damascus and Bosnia and Bursa and other places. And you see writers trying to connect these different disparate events into one larger framework and event. Now, there's two things that are going on here. One reason that the intellectuals at the time, the kind of educated elite, were particularly frustrated with is that the legalists were often let's say, gave more space to popular, uneducated, relatively, or less educated voices, let's say, people who didn't know how to read or argue or write properly. And two, that they also just didn't know how to use evidence. They didn't know how to participate in public debate in an educated, polite manner. And this led them to constantly dismiss and complain about their presence, at least in pamphlets, and try to organize against them. The other thing that was occurring is that, as I pointed out, as people were reading pamphlets and splitting into kind of opposing factions of readers, different publics, you get one public that's basically an anti-legalist, often made of more learned Sufi scholars, Arab scholars, people who have authority and education and are using that to influence the government as much as possible to defend their traditions. And the other side is you have legalists and popular legalists who are much more less educated, more willing to go to the streets, more centered around sermons and material, and more importantly, are often they're also reading pamphlets and using pamphlets, but using them in a different way. They're often reading material that is not forged but falsely ascribed to major figures that they see as their leaders, people like Birgivi Mehmed, the 16th century pietist, or Kadizadeli Mehmed, the 17th century preacher. And so they attach themselves to these figures and read material that's not actually written by these people. They're written by a variety of other people, and it's not clear exactly who's writing it, but they're sort of in a, let's say, different information bubble than that of the educated elite who are an anti-legalist who are writing against them.
So what do you think then is the sort of legacy of all this? Because, I mean, obviously this particular movement, they sort of, they basically aren't around by the time you get to the middle of the 18th century, as far as we could tell. But what do you think the sort of lasting legacy was of them?
Yeah. I mean, I think on one hand, we can speak about polarization. So I make an argument that these polemics have a kind of get more and more heated over the course of the 17th century. So between, let's say, 1660 to 1700, you really see people going at it, trying to essentially, at least verbally, kill each other. And on occasion, this explodes into attacks on each other. But after 1703, after the Sultan gets deposed, and there's a kind of rethinking of the relationship between them. It's not clear what happens, but there's a de-escalation. There's a depolarization that's occurring there. And so by 1730, I don't see a deep connection between these polemics and the pamphlets anymore. Why that is, I'm not quite sure. I think part of the issue is that over the course of the 17th century, the body politic of the Ottoman Empire is transforming. It used to be run by essentially a slave elite, a very small slave elite that was kind of super administrators. And over the 17th century, this didn't work out anymore. There were too many freeborn Muslims who wanted to be part of the government, and they demanded their place in it, and they entered it. And that process of engaging and expanding the body politic beyond the small group of elite to many more people, I think part of that was reflected in the tensions around the pamphlets and whether or not these people can have a voice, whether they can participate, how should they participate, are they as educated and capable of being part of our world or not. So I think ultimately they were given a space and a voice that allowed for their participation. The other lasting legacy, I would say, is that one of the things I point out is that these pamphlets are not about news, right? So news, which is political information, emerges in early modern Europe as a space of public debate, as a topic, as a theme, right? But this is never about is the Sultan going to go to war, or is this person corrupt or not? Like, these are never about that. They're about like almost slightly atemporal, larger societal wide debates. And they're really about the things that affected all Muslims, not just local Muslims in Istanbul. And one of the things I point out is that the language of public debate from then on, I think, is primarily centered around law. It's a legal debate. So when you're debating over whether or not the saints should be worshipped or not, no one goes around and tries to say, well, really, I saw this miracle, and the saints are really true, and no, it's okay to worship at their graves because they really do have powers outside of the after death. That's not the nature of the argument. The argument's always about in legal discourse. And so when we look about why it is that legalist Islam, which is the predominant form of Islam today, why did it win out? I think maybe one of the things that we can say is that legalistic Islam was more suited to the kind of larger public debates that were emerging over the 17th and 18th century and continued into the 19th and 20th century. The other option is what Shahab Ahmed and others have argued, is that it's the imposition of colonial modernity by Europeans in the 19th century that transforms religion into more, from the multiplicity of Islams that used to be, to a more limited version. And I think that there's probably more evolutionist, more gradual explanations for what was going on than just the imposition of colonialism.
Yes, indeed. It's a very it's a very interesting but a very big area to sort of talk about, because it's probably co-evolutionist, but there's also conflation of other factors as well. So I sort of now coming towards the end of this. You've got sort of two future projects. I mean, the question I was going to ask is, what are you working on now? But you've already sort of listed two areas you're working on. So I sort of want to break that down a little bit. So the first thing I want to ask you about is this Turkish language in the Ottoman Empire. What is this about? What are you looking at?
Yeah. So I kind of two projects. One is, as you pointed out, is basically the kind of a social history of the Turkish language. So I've always been interested in kind of the language ideology, and I talk about it actually a good amount in the book. One of the things I realized as I was writing this book is that when people were learning to read, there was actually no way to learn Turkish. There's no textbook of Turkish. There's no grammar of Turkish, unlike Arabic or unlike Persian at that time. So what you would do, even if you were a native Turkish speaker, is you would learn to read the Quran, you would learn to read Arabic, and then you would just kind of apply that reading knowledge to Turkish. So it's like, imagine, we were all just learning to read Latin, and then, now that you know the Latin alphabet, you can start reading English or something like that. Now, this is all well and fine, but then how did people actually learn Turkish for the use of high level of politics, for this courtly speech that needed to be used to engage with the government? And specifically, how did you learn it if you were not a native-born Turkish speaker? Right? Even the native-born Turkish speaker needed to learn this high level of Turkish, and they did that through socialization processes, the same way we might learn high levels of English today, right? Through just reading a lot and engaging with other educated people. But if you weren't part of those social circles, how did you engage with Turkish, and how did the impact of, let's say, Arabs in Cairo, or Christians, for example, Greek-speaking Christians, how did they learn Turkish? How did they engage with it? So I already wrote one article looking at basically how did the one group, there was only one group of Christians that apparently managed to gain high levels of Turkish. They were called Phanariates. And this is quite different from what we would have in the Mughal Empire, where you had large amounts of Hindus learning Persian, speaking Persian, involved in the Mughal government, Islamic government. And you just don't have that in the Ottoman Empire. You have very few non-Muslims involved directly in the bureaucracy and the running of the government. And so what I wanted to find out is kind of what is the social and cultural valence of Turkish? How did people engage with it? If we write the history of Turkish from the provinces rather than from the center, what would it look like? And ultimately, I think there's other things here too. Like we often write the histories of languages as the histories of national communities, that is like separate from the other communities out there. And that's not true. Everyone, you have to write the history of Turkish in relationship to Arabic and Persian, and also Greek and Armenian and other things, and to see how all those different aspects of the early modern Middle East integrated together into a whole linguistic world.
And the sort of last project that you're doing, or the other project, sorry, you're doing, which is on antiques and antiquarianism in the modern Middle East. What's that about?
Yeah. So you might know this, but if you think about the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is centered around a rediscovery of the ancient world. That's both in literature, the revival of Latin and Greek literature, the relearning of Latin rhetoric, but also it involves finding ruins, looking at the material landscape, recreating that in architecture, etc. And so that vision of the revival of antiquity is a central part of European early modern thought. Now, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, they don't rediscover the ancient world, both literally not, but they had the same ruins around and the same legacy. They still have the same classical legacy that they were using. And until recently, basically, there's a belief that it was only in the 19th century that this was sort of revalued and taken up again. And that's in response to rapacious European looting and emphasis on antiquities that Europeans had. And I wanted to look at a different question, which is essentially, well, how did people actually engage with antiquity? Did they have a concept of antiquity, of antiquarianism, of actually looking at the material aspects of the past, and trying to use those to question, their sense of time, their sense of being, in particular, their sense of religiosity? How did that all come together in their intellectual world? How did they use the notion of antique in their thought, beyond just saying that it was a 19th century adoption? So I wrote an article again about this. Came out a year or two ago in the Renaissance Quarterly, and so I looked at one major scholar, Abdelghani Nabulsi, this guy writing Damascus at the end of the 17th century. He goes to the Roman temple of Baalbek. He sees it, but he argues that it's not actually a Roman. He argues it's a palace built by the jinns for Solomon. And as I argue in the article, I think that he actually he understood that it was a Roman temple, but for him that didn't matter because he had an entirely different temporal outlook. Like for him, the important part was going back to the original antique understanding of that space, which was it being used for built by jinns for Solomon. And he provides he goes through very in detail, goes through every piece of it, gives all this evidence and explanation of why he thinks that. And everything in between was just sort of irrelevant renovation. So the fact that it was later used as a Roman temple, or it was later used as a Mamluk castle, or the stuff was just kind of additional information that he just discarded because it was irrelevant. And so I tried to show why it is that he thought that, and the complexity of his thought, and also how it ties into the kind of religious arguments at the time over the nature of Islam.
Yeah, so it's basically, in a sense, the equivalent of ancient aliens, where you get people who go to the pyramids today and say, well, aliens clearly built this. That's playing into a sort of debate in of itself.
Right. And then there's other things. It gets more serious. They also have a different vision of antiquity. One of the things I talk about also is this recreation of the Kaaba, right? So in 1630, the Kaaba gets destroyed completely by a flash flood. Then the Ottoman government's like, okay, we're going to rebuild it. But then the locals essentially have a debate as to, well, how are they going to rebuild it? They argue that every piece of the Kaaba should be put back in place as it once was. That is like a sort of ahistorical structure, or it's a historical structure, I guess. Whereas the government says, well, no, the Kaaba has been destroyed many times. We can rebuild it in any way we want. It's an idea. It's not a piece of history. You just need a Kaaba. You don't need the same structure exactly, right? And so you see in these debates precisely the back and forth between local and imperial forces over different notions of historicity, and also have different ideas about what is Islam and who gets to define Islam. Is the imperial government or the locals? Does Islam change or not, and how, etc.
Nir Shafir, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Well, thank you, Osman, again for talking to me.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this one or watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.